Hey everyone, Two Angry Frogs here, and we have a refresh of our Ranged DPS tier list for patch 11.15. Almost on cue, the WoW dev team released a mass of class updates soon after the release of our last tier list. And it has been 3 weeks roughly since that update, so let's see where the dust has settled and what moves have been made. So the recent class tuning did not really change anything as far as how classes and specs play, but instead included buffs and, in some cases, nerfs to abilities to tune damage numbers. We'll still include all the same things we always do for our tier list, so we are comparing apples to apples, but only damage numbers will have an effect on where things land now. As a quick reminder, we include the following when looking at how we rank the Ranged DPS specs: ease of play, solo and group content, single target and AoE DPS, and general utility. So starting with Balanced Druid, it overall received a 3% buff to all spell damage. Remaining buffs were primarily in single target damage abilities, with Star Surge and Power of Goldrun damage increased by 3%. This did prove enough increase to now take Power of Goldrun in single target, so the spec talent tree has changed just a bit from its 11.1 build. On the AoE side, we have 10% damage nerf to Starfall, and in the case of Elun's Chosen, a 10% nerf to Boundless Moonlight, Fury of Elune Final Flash, and minor moon damage. Even with these nerfs, however, we still take Elun's Chosen for Mythic Plus AoE, and the recommended single target hero spec remains Keeper of the Grove as well. The buffs to single target did not do much to really move balance, and compared to prior rankings, it sits pretty much in the same spot as before, in the bottom third of Ranged DPS. But for Mythic Plus AoE, even with the nerfs, it is still a powerhouse and sits in the top 2 Ranged DPS. So we're leaving Balanced Druid in A tier. For mages, as far as Arcane Mage, overall it received a 4% buff to all damage. Remaining buffs were specific to Sun Fury hero talents, with a 25% increase to Arcane Phoenix area of effect damage, and a 10% increase to Meteorite damage. The buffs to single target have had an impact on Arcane standings, bringing it from the lower half of Ranged DPS into the top 4. And the Sun Fury buffs look to have pulled it ahead of Spellslinger for the recommended single target hero talents. For Mythic Plus AoE, not much has changed, and Arcane sits pretty much where it did before, and Spellslinger continues to be the choice for hero talents. Given the buffs to single target and the big moves that Arcane has made here, we do believe it's enough to pull it up to A tier. As far as Fire Mage, the buffs were all about attempting to bring the Frostfire hero talents in line and be more competitive with Sun Fury. Frostfire bolt damage was increased by 15%, Frostfire infusion increased by 30%, and Isothermic Core Comet Storm damage increased to 300% from 250% effectiveness. So, was it enough? That would be a strong no for both single target and Mythic Plus AoE, where Sun Fury continues to be by far the most widely selected hero spec. For single target, Fire continues to sit in a good spot in the top 4 of Ranged DPS, and stays pretty much in the middle for Mythic Plus AoE. It is still in a good position, so we are leaving it in A tier. Next up is Elemental Shaman, which was struggling with single target, but ranked well when it came to Mythic Plus AoE. In terms of buffs, like with most others, they primarily center on single target damage, with Earthshock and Elemental Blast damage increased by 8%. Remaining buffs were specific to Farseer hero talents, with Ancestor Lava Burst damage and Ancestor Elemental Blast damage increased by 15%. The single target buffs are not really enough, and Elemental Shaman still sits in the bottom 4. For Mythic Plus AoE, it did see some improvement and moved up into the top 4. For hero talents, Farseer is still the choice for single target, and Stormbringer continues to be the Mythic Plus AoE choice. So without any major change in where Elemental stands, we're leaving it in B tier. So we did see some tuning to all 3 of the Warlock specs. For Affliction Warlock, we saw buffs to both single target and AoE damage. Agony damage was increased by 10%, Soul Rot by 30%, and Vile Taint by 40%. For single target, Affliction was in a really good spot, but the movement of other specs due to the tuning has pushed it down into the middle of the pack. For Mythic Plus AoE, Affliction was seriously struggling, and it still remains in the bottom 4. So overall, it took a slight drop in single target and did not change in Mythic Plus AoE. For hero talent selections, Soul Harvester is still the predominant choice for single target, and Hellcaller for Mythic Plus AoE, so we have no change here. Although it did drop some in single target, we don't think it's enough to knock it out of B tier. So for Demonology, we had some really nice buffs, and then they were pulled back quite a bit. The only buff that remained constant was Demon Bolt damage increased by 20%. Wild Imp damage was buffed to 25%, but then decreased to 20%. And then the Soul Strike and Pact of Arid Ruin Doomguard buffs were reverted completely. So after all of this, how did it impact Demonology? For single target, it still sits in the middle, and for Mythic Plus AoE, it remains in the top 4 of ranged DPS. So the reversion of buffs did not really help Demonology. For hero talents, Diabolist is prevailing in all types of content. For now, with very little movement, it remains in B tier. Oh, Destruction Warlock. It's just in a bad spot, and it only got worse with the tuning. The buffs themselves are all concentrated in AoE damage, with Cataclysm damage increased by 35%, and Rain of Fire damage increased by 25%. Without any single target related buffs, and buffs causing movement of other specs, Destruction hits the bottom 2 of all ranged DPS in single target. And it's not any better for Mythic Plus AoE. The buffs really did nothing to help, and unfortunately Destruction gets the dubious honor of sitting in the bottom 2 of the AoE charts as well. So all around, it's bad news for Destruction players. It was barely hanging on to B tier, but with even more downfall, currently we're going to drop it into C tier. For the remainder of the ranged DPS specs, there were no tuning updates, so anything that changes with their standings is purely based on movement of the specs that did have changes. So we'll start with Frost Mage, and prior to the tuning, it was not in a great spot, sitting in the middle of the pack for single target and in the bottom 2 for Mythic Plus AoE. And while it has moved up a spot in the AoE rankings, it is not nearly enough to pull it up, so it stays in C tier. For Beast Mastery, there were no positional changes for single target, and it remains in the middle of the pack. However, for Mythic Plus AoE, it dropped slightly and is now in the bottom 4. This is not great news for Beast Mastery players, but we don't think the drop is significant enough to move it out of B tier. In contrast to Beast Mastery, Marksmanship Hunter is now the top ranged DPS spec. It was in the top 2 for single target and stayed in that position after the class tuning. For Mythic Plus AoE, it was also in a good spot and is now in the top 2 as well. So if you want to play solo, raid, run Mythic Plus, or choose your content, it's currently great at all of it. We rarely call a spec S tier, but for Marksmanship, we do think it belongs there, given how strong it is in all areas. For Shadow Priest, there's little to report, and its positioning in single target, where it sits in the middle of ranged DPS, and Mythic Plus AoE, where it sits in the bottom 2, remains the same. So for now, Shadow Priest remains in C tier. Finally, for Devastation, it was already in a good spot among the top 2 in single target, and top 4 in Mythic Plus AoE. The class tuning did nothing to hurt its positioning, and it stays the same after the changes. So for now, we're going to keep it in A tier. So there was a lot of text in the tuning updates, but the changes did not really have a major impact on where the ranged DPS specs landed, outside of Arcane Mage, Destruction Warlock, and Marksmanship Hunter. And in some cases, it actually hurt some specs. This is partially due to other class and spec movement, but also can be impacted by the emergence of new talent builds, hero talent selections, tweaks to the rotations, and so on. So we'll see where things go from here and make our next update when the next big round of tuning comes in or we hit Season 3. As always, let us know your thoughts and any questions you have down below in the comments. And make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you always know what's coming up next. And a special shout out to our members for your continued support. We thank you very much. And everyone, have a great day.